I'd spent 3 years at LaGuardia watching humanity at its absolute worst. The woman who'd thrown her iced latte at me because we were holding her flight hostage during a weather delay wasn't even in my top 10 anymore. Neither was the man who'd threatened to sue me personally because his carry-on was 2 inches too large and I'd made him check it. That honor belonged to the businessman who'd called me every vile name in the book, then smiled for his Instagram story about dealing with incompetent airport staff, all while I stood 3 feet away trying not to cry during my 12-hour shift. 3 years of that. 3 years of fluorescent lights, recycled air, and the constant grinding anxiety that came from knowing that no matter what I did, someone was going to scream at me. The passengers were miserable, which made them cruel. My co-workers were burned out, which made them bitter. Management was understaffed and overworked, which made them absent when it mattered. I was drowning, and I knew it. The Sunday night I finally snapped was unremarkable. A delayed flight from Atlanta. Standard turbulence. Nothing dramatic. But the passengers deplaned like survivors of a war zone, and I became their enemy. One man actually grabbed my shirt, grabbed it, demanding I personally compensate him for his emotional trauma. Security had to intervene. My supervisor filed an incident report and told me to develop thicker skin. I went home at 2 a.m, sat on my couch in the dark, and opened my laptop. The job boards were the same wasteland they'd always been. Customer service positions that paid less than my rent. Management roles requiring 10 years of experience for entry-level pay. I scrolled through pages of the same recycled postings, feeling that familiar weight of hopelessness settling in my chest. Then I saw it. Night Shift Airport Operations Associate, One Pine Regional Airport. The listing was sparse, almost suspiciously so. Remote location, minimal passenger traffic, overnight hours, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. The pay was listed as $8,000 per month, paid weekly in cash. I read that number 3 times, certain it was a typo. That was more than double what I was making at LaGuardia. The job description was even stranger. Manage airport operations during overnight hours. Minimal customer interaction. Perfect for candidates seeking quiet, independent work environment. Immediate hire available for qualified applicants. There was a Zoom link for interviews, available 24/7. I should have been suspicious. I should have questioned why a tiny regional airport would pay that much for a night shift position. I should have wondered why they were so desperate for immediate hires. But I was desperate too, and desperation makes you ignore red flags that are bright enough to blind you. I clicked the link at 2:47 a.m. James answered on the second ring. He appeared on my screen in what looked like an office, though I couldn't make out much detail behind him. He was maybe 50, completely bald, wearing a crisp white shirt and a friendly smile that reached his eyes. He looked like someone's kindly uncle, the type who'd give you advice about your career over Thanksgiving dinner. "You must be inquiring about the position," he said warmly. "I'm James, airport manager here at One Pine. And you are?" I gave him my name, stumbling over my words slightly. "I saw the listing just now. I know it's late." No, perfect timing actually," he interrupted, that smile never wavering. "We operate around the clock here. Well, someone needs to anyway. Tell me about yourself." I gave him the abbreviated version of my resume, trying to sound professional despite my exhaustion. He listened attentively, nodding at appropriate moments. But I noticed something odd. His eyes. They were warm and friendly, but underneath that warmth was something else. Something heavy and tired, like he was carrying a weight he could never quite put down. "You mentioned minimal customer interaction," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "What does that actually mean?" "One Pine is... well, it's not LaGuardia," James said with a soft chuckle. "We get maybe a dozen flights a week during the day. At night, you'd be lucky to see one person every few nights. Mostly you're there to keep the lights on, monitor the building, handle the occasional unexpected arrival. Very quiet, very peaceful. It sounded too good to be true, which usually meant it was. But I was so tired. "The pay seems... high?" "It is." James said, cutting through my hesitation. I'll be honest with you. The isolation is difficult. The hours are difficult. Most people don't last more than a few nights. We need someone who can commit, who can follow instructions precisely, and who values peace and quiet over excitement. There was something in the way he said excitement that made my skin prickle, but I pushed the feeling away. I can start immediately, I heard myself say. James's smile widened, but it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. Excellent. Excellent. When can you get here? I have to give notice. 2 weeks? He waved his hand dismissively. Tell you what, start this Friday. I'll email you the address, some basic information. We'll handle the paperwork when you arrive. First week is a trial period, paid daily in cash. If it works out, we'll make it official. How does that sound? Everything about this screamed scam or worse, but I thought about that man grabbing my shirt, about my supervisor's dead eyes, about 3 more years of the same hell stretching endlessly before me. That sounds perfect, I said. Wonderful. I'll see you Friday at 9:30 p.m. Don't be late. I need to get you oriented before the day shift leaves at 10. He started to reach for something off screen, then paused. Oh, and one more thing. Do you have any problems with following rules? Very specific rules? No, I said. I'm good with rules. Good, James said, and for just a moment, his friendly mask slipped and I saw what was underneath. Exhaustion so profound it looked like grief. You'll need to be. The call ended. I submitted my resignation to LaGuardia the next morning via email. My supervisor's response was a single sentence. Understood. Good luck. My last day was Thursday. It was exactly as miserable as every other day had been, except now I was counting down the hours until I could leave and never come back. A family of 5 screamed at me about seat assignments. A man called me incompetent because I couldn't magically produce his lost luggage. My supervisor reminded me to turn in my badge and uniform. At 10 p.m., I walked out of LaGuardia for the last time. I didn't look back. Friday evening, I loaded my car with the few things I might need, some books, my laptop, extra clothes. The drive to One Pine took 4 hours, taking me steadily away from the city and into increasingly rural territory. The highways became state routes, then county roads. Houses grew farther apart. Cell service became spotty. One Pine itself was barely a town, maybe 2,000 people judging by the single main street lined with dark storefronts. The airport was 3 miles past the town center, accessible by a single winding road. I saw it as I came around the final bend, a small, almost charming building of red brick and white trim, sitting in a vast parking lot illuminated by a handful of streetlights. A single runway stretched behind it, disappearing into the darkness. One small plane sat near a hangar, a white Cessna. The terminal couldn't have been more than 5,000 square feet. It was 9:28 p.m. I parked near the entrance and grabbed my bag. The air was cold and clean, so different from the city. Above me, stars stretched across a sky unpolluted by light. It was beautiful and unsettling in equal measure. Too quiet, too dark beyond the small circles of light. The terminal's glass doors were unlocked. Inside, it was exactly what I'd expected from a tiny regional airport. A modest check-in counter, a small waiting area with maybe 30 seats, a single security checkpoint, and, visible through large windows, what must have been the gate area and a sky bridge leading to the tarmac. Everything was old but well-maintained, clean but worn, like someone's grandmother's living room. James stood behind the check-in counter, talking to 2 other people, a young woman in a cashier's uniform and a security guard who looked barely 20. They all stopped and looked at me when I entered. "Right on time," James called out, his friendly mask firmly in place. He gestured me over. "Everyone, this is our new night operations associate." He rattled off my name to the others, then introduced them. "This is Ashley, our day cashier, and Marcus, day security." They both gave me tight smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Ashley actually looked at me with something close to pity. "We're just finishing up," James said, glancing at his watch. "Got to get everyone out by 10. Sharp." I set my bag down behind the counter, watching as Ashley and Marcus gathered their things with practiced efficiency. Neither of them seemed interested in small talk. Marcus nodded at me once as he headed for the door, muttering something about good luck that sounded more like a warning. Ashley paused on her way out, opening her mouth as if to say something, then closing it again. She glanced at James, then back to me. "Bathroom's through there," she said, pointing. "Break room is behind the counter. There's coffee." "Thanks," I said. She hesitated one more second, then left. Suddenly, it was just me and James in the empty terminal. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, I could see the parking lot emptying as Ashley and Marcus drove away. "Right then," James said, and I heard the exhaustion in his voice now, no longer hidden by forced cheerfulness. "Let's get you oriented. You'll be alone from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. Your job is simple. Monitor the building, keep the lights on, handle any unlikely arrivals. The phone won't ring. We don't get calls at night. The computer is just for show. Nothing needs to be logged. Mostly, you're just here. That's it? Mostly." He reached under the counter and pulled out a laminated sheet of paper. It looked old, the edges worn from handling. "These are the rules. You need to follow them exactly. No exceptions, no variations, no improvisation. Understand?" The way he said it made my stomach twist. "What kind of rules?" "The kind that keep you alive," he said flatly, and there was no smile now, no friendly uncle warmth, just a bone-deep weariness, and something that might have been fear. "Read them, memorize them, follow them. That's the job." He pressed the laminated sheet into my hands. I could feel how much he wanted to leave, how every second he stayed was costing him something. "James, 9:52, he said, checking his watch. "I need to go. Check the weather every hour. It matters. Everything you need is here. First payment is in the safe. Combination is your hire date, month-day-year. Any questions can wait until tomorrow." He was already moving toward the door, gathering his coat and briefcase with jerky, urgent movements. "Wait, what if—" "Follow the rules," he said, one hand on the door. He looked back at me one final time, and in his eyes, I saw an apology. "I'm sorry. I really am, but someone needs to be here." Then he was gone, the glass door swinging shut behind him, his car's headlights sweeping across the terminal as he pulled away faster than necessary. I stood alone in the empty airport, the only sound the hum of fluorescent lights and the distant rush of my own blood in my ears. The terminal stretched before me, empty chairs, dark security checkpoint, the long corridor leading to the gate area. Everything was still and quiet and ordinary in a way that felt fundamentally wrong. I looked down at the laminated sheet in my hands. At the top, in bold letters, "Night Shift Rules, One Pine Regional Airport." Below that, 6 numbered items in plain black text. My hands were shaking slightly as I began to read. I read the rules 3 times before they started to feel real. Rule 1. All lights must remain on. Darkness is a conduit for something else. If a light is broken, leave the area. Do not listen to the sounds or voices. Rule 2. If it rains or storms, rules 3, 4, and 5 are void. Stay inside and avoid the men's restroom. Rule 3. Elizabeth appears between 11 p.m. and 1 a.m. Do not speak to her. Nonverbal communication only. If you speak, retreat to the men's restroom until she leaves. Rule 4. The janitor appears around 1 to 2 a.m. Ask his name. Only admit Simon. Any other name, lock him out. Simon is safe to converse with. Rule 5. A black and red Cessna Skyhawk will appear around 3 a.m. Do not look at it after the first time you see it. Rule 6. Armed men may arrive before dawn. They can search and question, but they are absolutely forbidden from entering the sky bridge. They cannot harm you if you refuse them. The first time through, I waited for the punchline. Some elaborate hazing ritual for new hires, maybe a test to see if I was gullible enough to believe in ghost stories. The second time, I noticed the wear on the laminated edges, the way certain words were emphasized, the clinical precision of the language. This wasn't a joke. Someone had written these rules the way you'd write emergency procedures, because lives depended on them. The third time, I checked the clock. 10:07 p.m. Then I checked my phone for the weather. Clear skies. Temperature dropping to 42 degrees. No precipitation expected. Rules 3, 4, and 5 were active tonight. I set the laminated sheet on the counter where I could see it, then forced myself to explore the terminal. If I was going to spend 8 hours here alone, I needed to know the layout. The check-in area was straightforward. Counter, computer that James said was just for show. A small office behind it with a safe bolted to the floor. The waiting area held those 30-odd seats, all facing windows that looked out onto darkness and the distant runway lights. The security checkpoint was unmanned, a single metal detector and X-ray machine sitting idle. Beyond it, a corridor led to the gate area, a modest space with another 20 seats and large windows overlooking the sky bridge. The sky bridge itself was an enclosed walkway stretching maybe 50 feet to where it would connect to aircraft. I stood at its entrance, looking down its length. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular airport white-blue that made everything look slightly unreal. Rule 6 mentioned the sky bridge specifically, forbidden territory for whoever those armed men were. I checked every light as I walked. They all worked. Good. The break room behind the counter held a coffee maker, a small refrigerator stocked with water bottles, and a microwave. A door labeled MEN led to a bathroom with 2 stalls and a sink. I examined it more carefully than I wanted to, noting the lock on the inside of the door, the small window near the ceiling, the way sound echoed off the tile. Rule 3 said to retreat here if I spoke to Elizabeth. I walked back to the counter, poured myself coffee I didn't want, and sat down on the stool. The terminal stretched empty before me. Outside, wind moved through trees I couldn't quite see, causing shadows to shift at the edges of the parking lot lights. 10:34 p.m. I opened my laptop, thinking I might browse the internet, but the Wi-Fi password James never gave me. My phone had 2 bars of service. I could call someone if I needed to, though who I'd call and what I'd say I had no idea. The minutes crawled. I found myself reading the rules again, memorizing the specific phrasings. Do not speak to her, not don't talk, but specifically do not speak. Nonverbal communication only. That meant I could still interact, just not verbally. Nods, smiles, gestures. I could work with that. Ask his name, the janitor. An active test, not passive observation like with Elizabeth. Do not look at it after the first time. The plane. Implying I would see it, should see it once, but then had to ignore it. At 10:58 p.m., I walked to the windows and looked out at the runway. The white Cessna I'd seen when I arrived was still parked near the hangar, perfectly ordinary. The sky was clear, stars visible. Normal. Everything was normal. I checked the weather again, still clear. 11:02 p.m. I heard the heels first. The sound came from somewhere near the entrance, a precise rhythmic clicking against the tile floor. Click, click, click. Steady and deliberate. The sound of someone who knew exactly where they were going. My heart rate spiked immediately. I grabbed the laminated sheet, rereading Rule 3 even though I'd memorized it. Nonverbal only. Don't speak. I positioned myself behind the counter, standing up straight, trying to look professional and calm. The clicking grew louder. Then she appeared. Elizabeth was stunning in a way that seemed almost impossible. The kind of beauty that belonged in old Hollywood films, not a rural airport at 11 p.m. on a Friday night. She looked mid-20s, with dark hair styled in soft waves that framed her face. She wore a knee-length skirt, a fitted blouse, and heels that explained the clicking, Her style was distinctly old-fashioned, like she'd stepped out of the 1950s. She pulled 2 large suitcases behind her, one in each hand. "Oh, hello," she said brightly, her face lighting up with a warm smile as she saw me. I wasn't sure anyone would be here this late. I smiled back and nodded, keeping my lips pressed firmly together. She approached the counter, those heels clicking with each step, and I caught her scent. Something floral and sweet, like jasmine mixed with vanilla. It was pleasant but strong, filling the space between us. "This is so lucky," she continued, her voice musical and genuinely delighted. "My flight got delayed in Chicago, and I was worried I'd miss my connection entirely. Is there anyone I can speak to about rebooking?" I shook my head slowly, then gestured to the clock and shrugged apologetically, trying to convey that the day staff was gone. "Oh, I see," she said, her smile dimming just slightly. "Well, do you know when someone might be available? In the morning, perhaps?" I nodded, then held up 6 fingers, followed by pointing to the clock. 6 a.m. 6 in the morning, she repeated, processing this. Then her smile returned, brighter than before. "That's all right. I suppose I can wait. It's not like I have anywhere else to go." She laughed, a light, pleasant sound, and set her suitcases down with a heavy thud that seemed wrong. The cases looked like standard rolling luggage, maybe 2 feet tall, but the sound they made hitting the floor was like dropping cement blocks. The floor tile actually vibrated beneath my feet. Elizabeth didn't seem to notice anything unusual. She pulled one of the waiting area chairs closer to the counter, arranging herself gracefully. "I hope you don't mind if I wait here. It's so cold outside." I nodded again, giving her what I hoped was a reassuring smile. "You're very kind," she said warmly. "Most airport staff I've dealt with are so rushed and impersonal. It's nice to find someone with a bit of courtesy." She studied my face for a moment, her expression curious. "You're new here, aren't you? I haven't seen you before." I nodded once more. "First night?" Another nod. "Well, welcome," she said, and there was something in her eyes. A flicker of something I couldn't identify. Amusement? Pity? It was gone too quickly to tell. "I'm sure you'll do wonderfully." She settled into her chair, crossing her legs elegantly, and pulled a book from her purse. For several minutes, she seemed content to read, occasionally glancing up at me with a friendly smile that I returned. The terminal felt smaller with her in it, more claustrophobic. The fluorescent lights seemed brighter, the hum louder. I kept glancing at the rules sheet, reminding myself, non-verbal only, don't speak. If I speak, retreat to the bathroom. At 11:24 p.m., she looked up from her book. "Would you mind terribly if I asked you a question?" I tilted my head, indicating she could ask. "Do you have any water? I've been traveling all day, and I'm absolutely parched." I held up one finger, wait a moment, and went to the break room. The refrigerator held at least 20 bottles of water. I grabbed one and returned, setting it on the counter. "Oh, you're an angel," Elizabeth said, standing and approaching to take it. Her fingers brushed mine as she accepted the bottle, and they were ice cold. Not cool, but genuinely cold, like she'd been outside in winter rather than sitting in a climate-controlled terminal. "Thank you so much." I smiled and nodded, backing away slightly. She opened the bottle and took a long drink, watching me over the rim. When she lowered it, she was still smiling. "You're quite dedicated to your work, aren't you?" So professional. Not saying a word, just doing your job efficiently. There was something in her tone now, a probing quality, like she was testing something. I kept my expression neutral and shrugged modestly. "Most people can't help themselves," she continued conversationally, returning to her seat. "They feel obligated to fill every silence with noise. Small talk about the weather, complaints about their job, meaningless pleasantries. But you're different. You're comfortable with silence." I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. She watched me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she smiled again, that same bright, warm smile, and returned to her book. The minutes stretched. I tried to focus on other things, checking the weather again, walking a circuit of the terminal, making another cup of coffee. But I was always aware of her presence. She was perfectly still when she read, barely moving except to turn pages. Occasionally, she'd hum softly to herself, a melody I didn't recognize. At 11:47 p.m., she stood and walked to the windows, looking out at the darkness. "It's so peaceful here," she said, almost to herself. "So quiet. You must enjoy that after working at—" She trailed off, turning to look at me with a curious smile. "Where did you work before?" "Somewhere busy, I'd imagine." I froze. This was a direct question, one that seemed to require a verbal answer. But the rule was absolute. Do not speak to her. I held up my hand in a gesture that tried to convey I'd rather not say, then turned back to the computer, pretending to focus on the blank screen. "Mysterious," Elizabeth said with a light laugh. "I like that." The clock crept toward midnight. My shoulders were tense, my jaw aching from keeping my mouth shut. Every time she spoke, I had to fight the instinct to respond verbally. It was harder than I'd expected. Not because I wanted to chat, but because silence in the face of direct questions felt fundamentally wrong, almost rude. At 12:03 a.m., something changed in the terminal's atmosphere. I felt it before I understood it. A subtle shift in air pressure, or temperature, or something I didn't have words for. The fluorescent lights flickered for just a fraction of a second. Then I heard footsteps from the corridor leading to the gate area, heavier than Elizabeth's heels. Work boots, the janitor. A man emerged into the check-in area wearing blue coveralls and carrying a mop bucket. He looked to be in his mid-30s, with a kind face and dark hair. He nodded at Elizabeth politely, then approached the counter. Rule 4 flashed through my mind. Ask his name. Only admit, Simon. "Evening," the janitor said calmly. His voice was steady and professional. "Didn't know we had a late arrival tonight." I found my voice, surprised by how rough it sounded after an hour of silence. "What's your name?" He looked at me with patient eyes. "Simon. I'm the night janitor." The relief that flooded through me was almost embarrassing. "Simon. Good. Come in." He gave me a small, knowing smile and rolled his bucket around the counter. "First night?" "Yes." Figured. He glanced at Elizabeth, who had returned to her seat and was watching us with interest. Then he looked back at me and spoke quietly. "You're doing fine. Keep it up." There was something reassuring about his presence, a sense of normalcy and competence that made the terminal feel less oppressive. He began mopping the floor near the security checkpoint, his movements methodical and calm. Elizabeth stood and approached the counter again. "Excuse me," she said sweetly. "I hate to be a bother, but would you happen to have any magazines?" Something to pass the time. I started to shake my head, but Simon spoke from across the room. "Check the office." Bottom drawer of the desk. James keeps some for waiting passengers. I glanced at him, then went to the office. The drawer held a stack of magazines, travel publications, news weeklies, a few fashion glossies. I grabbed a handful and brought them out, spreading them on the counter. Elizabeth's eyes lit up when she saw them, scanning the covers. Then she froze, staring at one in particular. It was a horror fiction magazine, the kind with creepy cover art and short story collections. The current issue, I noticed, featured a story I'd been wanting to read for weeks. "This one," she said softly, picking it up. "You like this one, don't you?" "I can tell." I blinked, surprised. How could she possibly know that? "Take it," she said, pushing it toward me with a genuine smile. "Please. Consider it a gift from a grateful passenger. You've been so kind tonight, and I want you to have something you'd actually enjoy." I stared at the magazine, then at her. This felt like a trap, but her expression was nothing but warm and sincere. The kindness in her eyes seemed real. I reached for the magazine slowly, and she beamed. Wonderful. I hope you get a chance to read it during your shift. Something in my chest twisted uncomfortably. She'd been nothing but polite and friendly all night. Sweet, even. And here I was, forced to treat her with this strange, unnatural silence, following rules that made me feel cruel. Simon's mop swished across the floor behind me, a steady, rhythmic sound. At 12:41 a.m., Elizabeth stood and stretched. "I think I'll take a walk around," she announced. "Clear my head a bit, if that's all right." I nodded. She smiled and headed toward the gate area, her heels clicking away. I waited until she was out of sight, then looked at Simon. "That was close," he said quietly, still mopping. "With the magazine." "What do you mean?" "You almost thanked her." His eyes met mine. "Didn't you?" I had. The words had been right there, automatic and polite. "Thank you." I'd swallowed them at the last second, catching myself. "The rules exist for a reason," Simon said gently. He moved closer, lowering his voice. "What you're feeling, that guilt, that sense you're being rude, that's intentional. That's part of it. She makes herself likable on purpose, makes you want to break the rule. What happens if you don't want to know?" he interrupted. "Just don't." The heels were clicking back, returning from the gate area. Elizabeth reappeared, looking refreshed. "What a lovely facility," she said. "Very well maintained." Simon nodded at her. "Thank you, ma'am." She smiled at him, then at me, then returned to her chair with her book. At 1:13 a.m., I felt my phone buzz in my pocket, a text from an unknown number. "You're doing good. Keep following the rules. J. James." Watching somehow. I looked around the terminal but saw no cameras. Maybe he just knew. Maybe this happened the same way every night, and he could predict exactly where I'd struggle. Elizabeth yawned delicately. "Goodness, it's late. Or early, depending on how you look at it." She checked a watch I hadn't noticed before. Another vintage piece, gold and elegant. "Almost 1:30. Time does strange things at night, doesn't it?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure what she meant. Simon finished mopping and rolled his bucket back toward the corridor. He paused near me, close enough that only I could hear. "You're almost through the worst of it. Stay strong." Then he was gone, disappearing down the hallway with his equipment. 1:37 a.m. Elizabeth closed her book and stood, smoothing her skirt. She approached the counter one final time, leaning against it with casual grace. "Well, I think I'll try to get some rest. Thank you for your patience tonight. You've been wonderful." I smiled and gave a small bow of my head, trying to convey appreciation. She studied my face for a long moment, something unreadable in her expression. Then she collected her impossibly heavy suitcases. I heard the strain in the wheels as she pulled them, and walked toward the seating area farthest from the counter. She arranged herself in one of the chairs, using her coat as a blanket, and closed her eyes. The terminal fell into silence. I checked the clock. 1:42 a.m. I checked the rules. Elizabeth appears between 11 p.m., 1 a.m. It was past her window. She should be gone. But she was still here, sleeping peacefully in the corner. My heart started to race. Was this wrong? Was this part of the pattern, or was something broken? I looked at the magazine she'd given me, still sitting on the counter. The cover was dark and atmospheric, promising exactly the kind of stories I loved. It had been a genuine kindness, and I hadn't even been allowed to say thank you. The thought hit me harder than it should have. The sheer cruelty of these rules, the way they forced me to be cold to someone who'd done nothing wrong. My throat felt tight, and before I could stop myself, I felt the words forming. I caught them just in time, biting down on my tongue hard enough to hurt, swallowing the "thank you" that had almost escaped. My hands were shaking as I gripped the counter. That was too close. Way too close. The hours between 2 and 3 in the morning moved differently than normal time. I sat behind the counter, staring at Elizabeth's sleeping form in the distant corner, and felt something fundamental shift in my understanding of reality. She shouldn't be here anymore. Rule 3 said she appeared between 11 and 1, and it was nearly 2. But there she was, breathing slowly and evenly, her coat pulled up to her chin like any tired traveler trying to rest in an uncomfortable chair. Maybe I'd misunderstood the rule. Maybe appears between meant something different than I thought. Maybe this was normal, and my anxiety was just exhaustion playing tricks. I checked the weather again, still clear, checked the lights, all on, checked the rules sheet until the words blurred together. At 2:17 a.m., I made another pot of coffee I didn't want, just to have something to do with my hands. The break room felt smaller at night, the fluorescent lights somehow both too bright and not bright enough. I stood at the counter, drinking bitter coffee and watching the empty terminal, listening to the building settle around me. The silence was oppressive. In the city, there was always noise. Sirens, traffic, the constant hum of humanity pressed too close together. Here, the quiet had weight and texture. I could hear the refrigerator's compressor cycling in the break room, the buzz of the lights overhead, my own breathing. At 2:34 a.m., I walked the terminal again, partially to stay awake and partially to reassure myself that everything was still normal. The security checkpoint sat empty. The gate area was dark beyond its windows. The sky bridge stretched away into nothing, its lights creating pools of white-blue illumination that made the darkness at either end look somehow solid. I paused at the windows overlooking the runway. The white Cessna was still there, exactly where it had been when I arrived. Ordinary and unremarkable. I stared at it for a long moment, then checked my watch. 2:41 a.m. Rule 5 said 3 a.m. I walked back to the counter, my footsteps too loud in the silence, and sat down. Elizabeth hadn't moved. Her chest rose and fell with perfect regularity. She looked peaceful, almost angelic in the harsh fluorescent light. The coffee wasn't helping. I was exhausted but wired, my nerves stretched thin from hours of forced silence and hypervigilance. Every small sound made me jump. Twice, I'd started to speak to myself out of habit, just muttering observations or complaints the way I did when I was alone, and had to catch the words before they escaped. At 2:53 a.m., my phone buzzed. Another text from James. Almost through the worst. Stay alert. I wanted to text back, to ask him what was coming, why Elizabeth was still here, what I should do, but I suspected he wouldn't answer. This was something I had to experience myself. The minutes crawled toward 3. At 2:58 a.m., I stood and walked to the windows again, drawn by a compulsion I didn't fully understand. The runway stretched into darkness, the white Cessna visible only because of the distant lights near the hangar. At 2:59 a.m., I checked my watch obsessively, watching the second hand sweep around. At 3 a.m. exactly, the black and red Cessna appeared. There was no sound, no flash of light, no dramatic entrance. One moment, the runway was empty except for the white plane in the distance. The next moment, maybe 200 feet from the terminal, sat a Cessna Skyhawk painted in colors that seemed wrong even in the dim light. Black body with red trim that looked too vibrant, too saturated, like it was bleeding into the air around it. My breath caught in my throat. The plane sat at an odd angle, not quite aligned with any taxiway or parking spot, just sitting there in the middle of the tarmac as if it had been dropped from the sky. And beside it, barely visible in the ambient light, stood a figure. The silhouette was human-shaped, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. Too tall, maybe, or too thin. It stood perfectly still next to the plane's wing, and even from this distance, I could feel it watching the terminal. Watching me. Every instinct I had screamed at me to look away, but I couldn't. The figure didn't move, didn't gesture, just stood there in a way that made my skin crawl and my stomach twist. There was something about its proportions, its stillness, that my brain couldn't process correctly. Stop looking at it. I jerked back from the window, my heart hammering. Simon stood behind me, having materialized silently from somewhere. He held a mop handle and regarded me with patient, sad eyes. I said, "Stop looking at it." He repeated gently, "First look is fine, that's expected. But now you need to turn around and not look again." I nodded jerkily and forced myself to turn my back to the windows. My hands were shaking. "What is it?" "Doesn't matter what it is," Simon said. "Matters that you don't look at it again." He gestured toward the break room. "Made fresh coffee. Strong. You look like you could use some." I followed him on unsteady legs, grateful for his calm presence. In the break room, he poured me a cup of coffee that smelled considerably better than the pot I'd made earlier. I wrapped both hands around it, trying to stop their trembling. "First night is always hardest," Simon said quietly. "You're doing better than most." "Elizabeth is still here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "She was supposed to leave." Simon glanced toward the sleeping figure in the corner. "Rules are guidelines, not guarantees. She'll leave when she's satisfied. Or when." He trailed off, then shook his head. "Just keep following them." "What happens if I don't?" He looked at me with something like pity. "You don't want to know. Trust me on that." We stood in silence for a moment, and I felt my heartbeat gradually slow. The coffee was good, much better than mine. Rich and smooth, with just a hint of something I couldn't identify. Vanilla, maybe, or caramel. "Thank you," I said automatically, the words escaping before I could stop them. Simon's face went pale. "Oh no." From the terminal came a sound that made my blood freeze. A woman's voice, but wrong. The sweet, musical tone Elizabeth had used all night was gone, replaced by something that started as a sob and rose rapidly into a keening wail. I dropped the coffee cup. It shattered on the floor as I spun around. Elizabeth stood in the middle of the terminal, no longer sleeping, no longer peaceful. Her back was to me, her body rigid. The wail cut off abruptly, replaced by a sound like wet breathing. Then she turned around. Her face was wrong, still beautiful in its structure, but blood ran from both eyes in thick streams, pouring down her cheeks like crimson tears. Her nose bled too, a steady flow that dripped onto her blouse. But worse than the blood was her expression, grief so profound it seemed to warp the air around her, made worse by the smile that curved her lips, a smile that didn't match the devastation in her eyes. She was looking directly at me. "You spoke," she said, and her voice was a horrible amalgamation of that sweet tone and something guttural, something that came from deep in her chest. "After all my kindness, after everything, you spoke." I wasn't," I stammered, backing into the break room doorway. "To her," Simon hissed, grabbing my arm. "You spoke to her by speaking at all." "The bathroom. Now." Elizabeth's smile widened impossibly, her jaw unhinging slightly. The blood flowed faster now, and she began to sob, great, heaving sobs that shook her whole body. But the sobs turned to laughter within seconds, a cackling, broken sound that echoed off the terminal's walls. I ran. Behind me, I heard a tremendous crash, one of the heavy suitcases hitting the floor. Then another crash, closer, as if she'd thrown it. The sound of something incredibly heavy sliding across tile at high speed. I reached the men's restroom and threw myself inside, Simon right behind me. He slammed the door and locked it as something impacted the other side with enough force to crack the frame. "Don't listen," Simon commanded. But it was already too late. The sounds coming from the other side of the door were impossible. Elizabeth's voice multiplied, became a chorus of voices. Some sobbing, some laughing, some screaming words I couldn't quite make out. They layered over each other in a cacophony that made my head pound and my vision blur. Underneath the voices came other sounds. Footsteps that didn't match any human gait. The scrape of something being dragged. The wet, tearing sound of something that shouldn't be torn. And through it all, that laughter, high and broken and somehow triumphant. Something pounded on the door, not fists, something heavier. The door shuddered in its frame, and I heard the wood begin to splinter. I backed against the far wall, my breath coming in short gasps, and slid down to sit on the cold tile floor. Simon stood by the door, his expression grim but not panicked. He'd been through this before. He knew what was happening. How long? I managed to ask. Until she's done, Simon said simply. The pounding continued. The voices rose and fell in waves, sometimes coherent enough that I could almost make out words, sometimes dissolving into pure noise. At one point, I heard my name, not called out, but whispered by dozens of voices at once, a sibilant chorus that made my skin crawl. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't just auditory, it was something I felt in my bones, in my teeth, in the base of my skull. Time became meaningless. It could have been 5 minutes or 50. I sat on the bathroom floor, shaking, while the entity that had been Elizabeth raged on the other side of the door. All my skepticism, all my cynicism, all my rational explanations evaporated in the face of this impossible reality. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a test. This was something fundamental and terrible that existed beneath the surface of the world, and I'd stumbled into it because I was desperate for a quieter job. The irony would have been funny if I wasn't so terrified. Gradually, the sounds began to fade. The pounding slowed, then stopped. The voices diminished, one by one, until only a single voice remained, Elizabeth's original voice, sweet and musical. I forgive you, it said softly through the door. I understand. You were frightened. We all make mistakes. Then silence. I looked at Simon. He held up a hand. Wait. We sat in absolute quiet for what felt like an eternity. I strained to hear any sound from the terminal, but there was nothing. Just the hum of the ventilation system and my own ragged breathing. Finally, Simon spoke. It's over. His voice was weary. You can come out. Are you sure? I'm sure. He unlocked the door and opened it slowly, checking the terminal beyond. Then he nodded and stepped out. I followed on shaking legs. The terminal looked exactly as it had before. The chairs were in place. The floor was clean. Elizabeth's suitcases were gone. Elizabeth herself was gone. Even the coffee cup I'd dropped was missing, the floor spotless where it had shattered. I walked to the windows overlooking the runway. The black and red Cessna had vanished. Only the white plane remained in the distance, ordinary and unremarkable. It was 3:47 a.m. Somehow, less than an hour had passed. Simon stood by the counter, leaning on his mop. When I looked at him, I saw genuine sympathy in his eyes. I'm sorry you had to experience that, he said quietly. First night, first mistake. It happens to everyone. What was she? Does it matter? He shrugged. She's gone now. You survived. That's what matters. Will she come back? Every night, Simon said. Same time, same test. You'll do better tomorrow. You know what's at stake now. He collected his cleaning supplies and began walking toward the corridor. At the threshold, he paused and looked back. The rest of the night should be quiet, he said. Just a few more hours. You'll make it. Then he was gone, leaving me alone in the restored terminal with my shattered nerves and the certain knowledge that I'd been a fool to ever doubt the rules. I sat behind the counter and stared at the laminated sheet with new understanding. These weren't suggestions. They were survival instructions. And I just learned what happened when you failed to follow them. The hours after Elizabeth were the longest of my life. I sat behind the counter in the restored terminal, staring at nothing, my hands still trembling. The rational part of my brain kept trying to process what had happened, to find some logical explanation, but there was none. I'd seen something impossible. Experienced something impossible. and survived it only because I'd followed instructions written on a laminated sheet by someone who'd been through this same nightmare before me. Simon was gone. The terminal was empty again. The clock on the wall read 3:52 a.m., which meant I had 2 hours and 8 minutes left in my shift. 2 hours and 8 minutes of sitting alone in this place, knowing what it really was. I checked every light compulsively, walking the entire terminal 3 times in 15 minutes. All on, all functioning. I returned to the counter and read the rules for what must have been the 20th time that night, my eyes burning from exhaustion and stress. Rule 6 was the only one I hadn't experienced yet. Armed men may arrive before dawn. They can search and question, but they are absolutely forbidden from entering the sky bridge. They cannot harm you if you refuse them. Before dawn. That meant soon. I made coffee I wouldn't drink and paced the terminal, unable to sit still. Every shadow made me flinch. Every small sound, the building settling, the wind outside, the hum of electricity, sent my heart racing. I was jumpy in a way I'd never been before, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting something terrible to materialize. At 4:23 a.m., I walked to the windows overlooking the runway. The white Cessna sat peacefully in the distance. The sky was still dark, but there was a quality to the darkness that suggested dawn wasn't far away. Stars were beginning to fade. 2 hours left, maybe less. I returned to the counter and found my phone. 1 bar of service. I pulled up my messages and stared at the conversation with James, his cryptic warnings throughout the night. I wanted to text him, to demand answers, to ask what else was coming, but I knew he wouldn't respond. This was something I had to face alone. At 4:47 a.m. I heard it. Vehicles, multiple vehicles, approaching fast. I moved to the windows by the entrance and watched as 3 black SUVs tore into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. They screeched to a stop in a loose formation, and men poured out, 6, 7, 8 of them. They wore tactical gear, black vests, helmets, weapons visible on their belts and in their hands. But something was wrong about them. Their movements were frantic, disorganized. They moved like people running from something rather than approaching with purpose. One man separated from the group, no tactical gear, just a dark suit. He walked toward the entrance with quick, aggressive strides, while the others fanned out, some checking the perimeter, others just looking around nervously. Rule 6 flashed through my mind. They can search and question. They are forbidden from entering the sky bridge. They cannot harm you if you refuse them. The man in the suit reached the doors and tried them. Locked. He pounded on the glass with his fist, and I jumped despite myself. "Open up!" he shouted, his voice muffled but clear. "Federal agents!" "Open this door immediately." I approached slowly, my legs unsteady. Through the glass, I could see his face, mid-40s, clean-shaven, with eyes that were wild despite his authoritative tone. He looked terrified. I unlocked the door. He pushed past me immediately, followed by 2 of the tactical gearmen. The others stayed outside, their weapons drawn, scanning the darkness beyond the parking lot as if expecting an attack. "Who else is here?" the suit demanded, his eyes darting around the terminal. Up close, I could see the sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor in his hands. "No one," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "Just me." "Building secure?" one of the tactical men asked. He was young, maybe 25, and his finger rested near the trigger of his rifle. "As far as I know." The suit was already moving, checking the security checkpoint, looking down the corridor toward the gate area. The 2 armed men split up, one heading toward the break room, the other following the suit. "We need to search the entire facility," the suit said, returning to me. He pulled out a badge too quickly for me to read anything on it. "There's a credible threat in this area. We're conducting a sweep. Do you understand?" I nodded. "Good. Stay here. Stay out of our way." He gestured to the remaining tactical man. "Watch him." They moved through the terminal like a practiced team, but their fear was palpable. The suit kept glancing over his shoulder. The armed men moved with their weapons raised, clearing corners like they expected something to jump out at them. I stood behind the counter with the young tactical officer watching me. He looked exhausted, his eyes red-rimmed and bloodshot. "Long night?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer, just kept watching the corridor where his colleagues had disappeared. After several minutes, they returned. The suit's face was grim. "Gate area and corridor are clear. What's through there?" He pointed at the sky bridge. My stomach dropped. "Access to the tarmac. We need to search it." It wasn't a question. I looked at the laminated sheet on the counter, then back at him. "No?" The suit's expression hardened. "Excuse me?" "The sky bridge is off limits. You can't go in there." He took a step closer, his voice dropping to something dangerous. "Son, I don't think you understand the situation. We have authority to search this entire facility. Now step aside." I glanced at the rules sheet again, my heart pounding. "They are absolutely forbidden from entering the sky bridge," it read. "They cannot harm you if you refuse them." "No," I repeated, louder this time. "You can search everything else, but not the sky bridge." The tactical men exchanged glances. One of them shifted his grip on his rifle. The suit's jaw clenched. "You're interfering with a federal investigation. Do you understand the consequences of that?" "I don't care," I said, and I meant it. After what I'd seen with Elizabeth, these men didn't scare me. Their guns didn't scare me. Whatever was beyond that door, whatever had them so terrified they were sweating and shaking at dawn in a rural airport, that scared me. But refusing them? That was just following the rules. The suit pulled out a phone, typed something, waited. Then his expression changed. Anger mixed with something that looked like desperation. "Last chance," he said quietly. "Open that sky bridge, or we'll open it ourselves." I met his eyes. "No." He nodded to the tactical men. Two of them started toward the corridor leading to the gate area and the sky bridge entrance. "Stop," I said, but they ignored me. I looked at the rules sheet one more time. "They cannot harm you if you refuse them." I didn't move from behind the counter, didn't try to physically block them. Just stood there, holding that laminated sheet like a shield. The men reached the sky bridge entrance. The suit followed. I could see them through the gate area windows, see one of them reach for the door handle. Then everything went wrong. The lights in the gate area flickered. I heard the suit shout something. One of the tactical men screamed, a high, terrified sound that cut through the pre-dawn quiet. Gunshots. 3, 4, 5 shots in rapid succession, the sound deafening even from where I stood. The suit appeared in the corridor, running, his face white with terror. The tactical men followed, firing behind them at something I couldn't see. The muzzle flashes lit up the corridor in strobing bursts. More gunshots, closer now. I saw the young officer beside me raise his rifle, saw his finger squeeze the trigger, saw the barrel aimed directly at me. The sound was impossibly loud, then everything was black. "Wake up, come on, wake up." James's voice, gentle but insistent. I opened my eyes to find myself lying on the floor behind the counter. Morning light streamed through the terminal windows. Real sunlight, warm and golden. James knelt beside me, his bald head catching the light, his expression a mixture of relief and profound sadness. "There you are," he said softly. "Welcome back." I sat up slowly, checking myself for injuries. Nothing. No blood, no pain, no bullet wounds. My hands moved over my chest, my abdomen, my head. I was completely unharmed. "What? How?" "They can't actually hurt you if you refuse them," James said, helping me to my feet. "That's what the rule means. But they don't know that. They think they can. And when they fail, well, it usually goes badly for them." The terminal was empty. No SUVs in the parking lot, no tactical gear, no men in suits. Just morning sunlight and the quiet hum of a building at rest. On the counter sat a manila envelope, bulging with paper. $8,000, James said, following my gaze. First week, as promised. You made it through. I stared at the envelope, then at him. The anger that had been building since I woke up finally found its voice. You knew. You knew what was going to happen to me, and you sent me in here anyway. Yes, James said simply. No excuses, no deflection. Just that single word of admission. Why? My voice was rising. Why the hell would you do that to someone? Because someone needs to be here, James said, and his voice was so tired, so infinitely weary, that it took the edge off my anger. It wasn't fair for me either. I sat in that chair for 3 years, every night, following those rules, surviving, and before me, there was someone else, and before them, someone else, this place. It needs a keeper, someone to maintain the ritual. If no one's here, if the rules aren't followed. He trailed off, shaking his head. Bad things happen. Worse things than you saw tonight. I could leave, I said. Take my money and never come back. You could, James agreed. Most people do, after the first night. They take their payment and run. We start the hiring process over. He looked at me with those exhausted, knowing eyes. But you're not going to do that, are you? I wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell him to shove this job and this cursed airport and walk out that door into the normal world where planes were just planes and overnight shifts were just boring hours waiting for morning. But then I thought about going back to LaGuardia. Thought about the businessman who'd grabbed my shirt, the woman with her latte, the constant grinding hostility of passengers who saw me as an obstacle rather than a person. Thought about fluorescent lights and recycled air and the slow erosion of my humanity in the face of casual, daily cruelty. The choice between two kinds of hell. One where people treated me like garbage for minimum wage. One where supernatural entities tried to kill me for $8,000 a week, and all I had to do was follow some rules. I looked at the envelope of cash. $8,000 for one night. $32,000 a month. Almost $400,000 a year. For 8 hours a night of controlled terror, managed horror, ritualistic survival. Through the windows I could see the day staff arriving. Ashley pulled into the parking lot. Marcus followed a minute later. Normal people, doing a normal job, dealing with normal passengers during normal hours. I thought about my old supervisor's dead eyes. Thought about 3 more years of that stretching into 10, into 20, into a lifetime of being slowly ground down by the banality of everyday aggression. James watched me, saying nothing. He knew what I was thinking. He'd stood at this same crossroads himself, once upon a time. I picked up the envelope and tucked it under my arm. Then I turned my back on the entrance, on the arriving morning, on the normal world beyond those glass doors. "Show me your office," I said. "We need to talk about the schedule." James's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. Not relief exactly, but recognition. The passing of a burden from one carrier to another. The continuation of a cycle that might have started decades ago, or centuries, or longer. "Of course," he said quietly. "Follow me." As we walked away from the counter, away from the morning sunlight, I thought about what I'd chosen. Not hope, not freedom. Just a different kind of cage, with different rules and different monsters. But at least here, the monsters were honest about what they were. And some forms of hell, I was learning, were preferable to others.